It usually starts in ways that feel too small to matter, almost invisible at the moment they happen. A slightly more expensive habit chosen without calculation, a subscription left running because cancellation feels like effort, a preference for convenience over cost because time feels more limited than money in that moment. And none of these decisions feel significant individually, but they begin to accumulate inside a structure that most people never actually observe directly. At the surface level, financial life often appears to be driven by income, salary changes, promotions, or large purchases. But underneath that visible layer, there is a slower mechanism operating continuously, one that is built entirely from repetition, where each small decision acts like a unit of movement in a direction that only becomes visible after enough distance has been covered, and by then, the pattern is already established. The core concept here is compounding, but not just in the traditional sense of interest or investment returns. Rather, compounding as a behavioral system, where decisions themselves accumulate consequences over time, shaping not only account balances but expectations, habits, and what a person begins to consider normal spending behavior. To understand this, imagine two individuals with identical incomes over a long period, both earning the same amount consistently, both facing similar opportunities, but making slightly different everyday financial choices. Not dramatic differences, just subtle variations in how often they choose convenience, how quickly they adjust lifestyle upward after income increases, and how frequently they treat small expenditures as emotionally justified rather than structurally evaluated. In the first few months, the difference between them is negligible, almost impossible to detect in any meaningful financial statement. But as time extends, those small divergences begin to layer on top of each other, not linearly, but cumulatively, where each prior decision influences the probability of the next similar decision. And this is where compounding becomes psychological rather than purely mathematical. One of the key mechanisms driving this effect is what behavioral economics refers to as reference point adjustment, where a person's baseline expectation of normal spending shifts gradually based on repeated behavior, meaning that what once felt like an exception slowly becomes standard, and what once required justification no longer requires internal debate, reducing friction in spending decisions and increasing the velocity of small financial outflows. A single recurring expense of modest size may appear irrelevant in isolation, but when embedded in a system of multiple similar decisions, it begins to reshape the structure of available discretionary income, not by sudden depletion, but by consistent narrowing of financial flexibility, which then influences future decisions under slightly tighter constraints. At the same time, there is an opportunity cost layer that rarely gets acknowledged in real time, because each small financial allocation not only removes current liquidity, but also removes potential future optionality. And optionality is one of the most underappreciated components of long-term financial positioning, since it determines how easily a person can adapt, invest, or reposition when larger opportunities appear. What makes this system particularly powerful is that it does not rely on large errors or major financial mistakes. It functions entirely through normal behavior, through actions that are socially acceptable, psychologically justified, and often individually rational, which is why it remains largely invisible until cumulative effects become structurally significant. As time progresses, the difference between disciplined small decisions and unstructured small decisions does not just reflect in savings rates, but in exposure to compounding assets, in ability to absorb financial shocks, and in the range of choices available during critical life transitions, such as career changes, relocation, or investment opportunities. Mathematically, the structure is simple. Small differences in retained capital each month, when left uninterrupted, create exponential divergence over long time horizons, not because the rate of change is extreme, but because the duration of compounding is extended, and time is the variable that amplifies everything else in the system. However, the more important layer is not mathematical, but behavioral, because once a pattern of small spending inefficiencies is established, it tends to persist unless intentionally interrupted, not due to ignorance, but due to habit formation and cognitive ease, where the brain defaults to previously rewarded behavior to minimize decision fatigue. This creates a subtle feedback loop where financial decisions reinforce identity, And identity reinforces financial decisions, meaning that a person does not just spend in a certain way, but begins to see themselves as someone for whom that level of spending is normal, acceptable, or even necessary, which makes correction more difficult over time without deliberate awareness. If we extend this framework across a multi-decade horizon, the gap between two otherwise similar individuals can become substantial, not because one made a single superior decision, but because one maintained slightly higher consistency in small choices, allowing capital retention and growth mechanisms to operate with fewer interruptions. This is where financial systems begin to separate from financial events, because events are visible and memorable, while systems are continuous and often unnoticed. Yet it is the system that determines long-term outcomes far more than isolated moments of financial decision-making. An important implication of this is that improving financial outcomes does not always require large, dramatic changes, but rather structural attention to the frequency and quality of small decisions, especially those that feel emotionally neutral or insignificant, because those are often the ones least scrutinized. When viewed from a long-term perspective, the question is not whether a single expense is justified, but whether the repeated pattern of similar decisions aligns with the trajectory of accumulation, flexibility, and optionality that a person is implicitly building toward, whether consciously or not. Over time, the cumulative effect of small decisions becomes visible in the form of widened or narrowed financial range, meaning the distance between what is possible and what is constrained. And that distance determines not only financial comfort, but strategic freedom in life decisions. Ultimately, this system operates continuously, without pauses, without attention, and without regard for intention, which is why awareness alone is not sufficient unless it is translated into consistent behavioral structure, because the mathematics of compounding does not differentiate between intentional and unintentional inputs. It only records the outcome of repetition over time. And in that sense, small financial decisions are not actually small at all. They are simply early-stage expressions of long-term financial structure, which only becomes visible when enough time has passed for compounding to fully reveal its direction.